Hey everybody, it's Lance and welcome back to Pastor's Bible Study. We're continuing in Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, beginning with verse 53. Of course, you can jump in right now, but also know however it is that you're watching this lesson right now, we've got archives that go all the way back to the beginning of Mark. So you can go back, jump into the beginning, or you can resume right now. We're picking up in Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 53 through 56. Hear these words. When Jesus and his disciples had crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret, anchored the boat, and came ashore. People immediately recognized Jesus and ran around the whole region bringing sick people on their mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, villages, cities, or farming communities, they would place the sick in the marketplaces and beg him to allow them to touch even the hem of his clothing. Everyone who touched him was healed. So if you've been with us through the entirety of Mark's Gospel, you'll recognize a lot of the things that are happening here. Jesus and his disciples have traveled. They've been on the Sea of Galilee. They've left. They've come to a specific area. Gennesaret, it's not a city. It's more of a region. And it has a lot of different kinds of communities inside of that region. And Jesus begins to meet people, and it implies that he's preaching, but what he's definitely doing is healing. People, when they physically encounter Jesus, are encountering healing, and that's where I really want to dig into the text and what happens here. First, I want you to notice the response from the community. It's practical, for one. People are coming because they need to be healed, but there's a spiritual and theological element to it as well. And the combination of those things are, again, resulting in huge crowds and a really big response. When we talk about what's happening theologically, I want to bring up a couple words that might be easy for us to miss when we read in English, the significance of what they're writing when we're talking in the original languages and in the community in which Jesus is doing this healing. In verse 56, I'm reading right now from the Common English Bible translation. You might be reading from the New International Version or the New Revised Standard Version or the English Standard Version or any other number of translations from the original Greek into English. And one of the words that's translated in verse 56 is translated to say, the hem of his clothing. They would place the sick in the marketplaces and beg him to allow them to touch even the hem of his clothing. So now remember, this idea that coming forward and just touching the edges of Jesus's clothing could be receive healing was referenced earlier in Mark's Gospel. Remember the woman who was hemorrhaging, who had been considered ritually unclean for so long. In the midst of a crowded community, she reaches out and just touches the hem of his garment, and in doing so is healed. So there's something very special that's happening here. And again, the hem of the garment is what's brought up. And I want to point out that that word that's translated into him is, of course, originally a word in Greek. And I'm not going to mangle my Greek right now, but I want to point out that that word is used elsewhere in the Bible. It's specifically used to reference the edges of men's garments, frequently called tassels, that are first prescribed in the Hebrew Bible books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. One of the things that was prescribed in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and was a practice in Jesus's day and time and in our modern day of time, is the practice of faithful Jewish men wearing tassels that extend below their overgarments and that they wear that have 4 long corners that stick out below their overgarment. They wear these as a reminder of God's commandments. If you reflect back, you may have seen observant Jewish men today wearing very similar garments where the tassels kind of extend out below the end. And that can also be translated into the hem of a garment. That's what they are. And so I want to point out that when people are coming forward and actually touching Jesus, what they're touching is not just the hem like I have on my clothing today that denotes the edges of the garment, but they're actually touching something on him that has incredibly strong religious significance that signifies both his faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to the people of Israel. Think about what it would mean to say you go up and touch somebody and what it would mean to say you go up and touch the cross that they're wearing around their neck. Right? Those are very different things. That in our day and time, wearing a cross around your neck is significant. It signifies your faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to you. Well, the same thing is happening with those hems, those tassels, those edges of the garment. So when people are encountering Jesus's healing, they realize this isn't just something practical. I was ill and now I'm no longer ill. But what's also happening is happening through God's power. That's incredibly meaningful, and that actually ties in to another translation opportunity that we see here in the text. Also in verse 56, the translation that I'm reading says, "Everyone who touched him was healed." Well, that makes perfect sense because a lot of the people that are coming to Jesus have physical ailments and they're receiving physical healing. However, the original word in Greek that's written there can be translated very accurately into the word healing. It can also be translated into the word salvation. So what does it mean when you read this text? And it says, everyone who touched him was saved. Particularly realizing that what it is that they're touching are, again, these tassels that signify Jesus' faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to the people of Israel and to Jesus. Everyone who touched them was not only healed, they were also saved. And what does salvation mean in that context? And that's where we're bringing up the importance, again, you've heard me say it before, and here I'm saying it again. When miracles happen in the Gospels, there's always two levels to them, right? There's what's happening for the people in the story, and there's also what does this story teach us about who Jesus is for us today. So that's where I want to jump into our first question. Some people receive this lesson and participate it while walking in the dog, or maybe watching it during work or something along those lines. Some of you discuss it in groups. And so whether you're reflecting on this individually or whether you're doing it by with a group of people right now, part of a small group study, a group study through your church, I want to pause and I want to reflect on this question. Imagine that's what's happening here in this story is happening in a modern day scenario. Right? First, imagine what the crowd might look like if someone who is capable of doing this came to your community, right? Imagine what it would look like. Imagine what it would sound like. Imagine what the response in our version of media today would be, right? Just imagine what kind of response there would be. And then two, imagine what it would be like to recognize that the kind of healing that's taking place through this person is not only physical and related to ailments, but it's also spiritual and has something to do with spiritual healing, spiritual reconciliation, something that can only be called salvation because it's so complete and total. Imagine what that would be like. And then I want you to imagine who it is that you might want to bring to that person. Who is it in your life that has the need for physical healing? Who is it in your life that has a need for spiritual healing? And of course, is one of those people you? So that's what I want you to think about and discuss, whether you're doing it individually or as a group. Because remember, what's happening here has not only practical significance, but also theological significance. And it's about so much more than just physical healing. It's also about Jesus revealing himself as one who saves. Okay. So, moving over into chapter 7, I want to begin today with a pretty important point of reflection and teaching that Jesus is giving us. And we're going to start with a very short reading that's going to go a little bit longer. Let's just take the first 5 verses of chapter 7. The Pharisees and some legal experts from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus. They saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean hands. They were eating without first ritually purifying their hands through washing. The Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat without first washing their hands carefully. This is a way of observing the rules handed down by the elders. Upon returning from the marketplace, they don't eat without first immersing themselves. They observe many other rules that have been handed down, such as the washing of cups, jugs, pans, and sleeping mats. So the Pharisees and legal experts asked Jesus, "Why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down by the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands?" Okay, so let's pause here. First, if you are jumping in for the very first time and you haven't heard the words Pharisees or legal experts yet, those are fellow Jews who are focused on interpreting scripture in ways that they believe will lead to maximally following the instructions that God has for God's people. That leads to a lot of conflict between these people and Jesus because Jesus is a preacher and a teacher who has an interpretation and a way of teaching people to follow God that's very different than theirs, hence the conflict. And so when they're asking questions like this, it's not a good-natured question. It's usually a form of aggression or trying to undermine him. So The point that gets brought up here is the practice of ritual purity in regards to eating. And it can be, again, a little bit hard for us to read this because in our modern 21st century understanding, yeah, you really need to wash your hands before you eat. It is very smart and I highly recommend it. So washing your hands before you eat is a good practice, but in our world today, it's exclusively about hygiene, making sure that we're cleaning germs and bacteria off of our hands before we eat. Understand that in their context, they don't have that understanding. It's not about hygiene at all to them. Rather, it's about these ritual practices of purity or impurity, cleanliness or uncleanliness, that have a lot to do with religious perspectives and absolutely nothing to do with the concept of hygiene. So, from their perspective, if Jesus is a teacher and a follower, he's responsible for teaching these acts of piety to his followers, and his followers aren't doing it, so they come at him aggressively. Why are they not doing it? And specifically, why are they not following these practices that, this is key to see, and why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down by the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands? So they're pointing out your disciples aren't doing this, and specifically, they're not following all of these regulations that have been handed down from teachers who have come before them. So that's the question that they've asked. And now Jesus is going to answer back, but he's going to answer back the question that they should have asked. Does that make sense? So the question they asked was, why are disciples not living according to these rules and washing their hands and following these ritual purity things? Remember, we saw that before. That's taking place with the way that they observe Sabbath and things along those lines. Why are they doing this? And the question they should have asked ultimately is, what is it that's pleasing to God? Because that's what Jesus wants to talk about. And so you need to understand that that's the question he's really going to be answering when he begins to respond to them. So let's pick up chapter 7, verse 6 through 13. Jesus replied, Isaiah really knew what he was talking about when he prophesied about you hypocrites, Jesus says. He wrote, and now he's quoting from the prophet Isaiah, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. Their worship of me is empty, since they teach instructions that are human words. Then Jesus teaches again, you ignore God's commandment while holding on to rules created by humans and handed down to you. Jesus continued, clearly, you are experts at rejecting God's commandment in order to establish these rules. Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and the person who speaks against father or mother will certainly be put to death. But you say, if you tell your father or mother, everything I'm expected to contribute to you is korban, that is, a gift I'm giving to God, then you are no longer required to care for your mother or father. In this way, you do away with God's word in favor of the rules handed down to you, which you pass on to others. And you do a lot of other things just like that. Okay, so let's pause and unpack a little bit of what's happened here. These Pharisees and legal experts, right, these people who have frustrations with how it is that Jesus is teaching and preaching, and particularly how he's not having his followers follow these same practices, they criticize him. And Jesus points out something that's been true at least since the days of Isaiah, which is this frustration that God has that your worship of me is empty. It's not fulfilling. It's ultimately not pleasing, because instead of pursuing who it is that I have taught you to be, you are creating all of these rules, these human instructions for yourselves, and you're following them instead, right? Lessons about this ritual purity and washing of hands and things along those lines, those aren't God's commandments. Those are human teachings and practices, and people are taking those things much more seriously than what God has actually commanded them to do and who God has commanded them to be. And Jesus expands this by giving a really particular point. Moses said, honor your mother and father. He's reflecting back to remember the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. Honor your mother and father. It's a key direction from God on how you are to live and who you are to be. And what people have come up with in its place is this concept of korban. So in their world, Some preachers and teachers had come up with the idea of korban, meaning anything that you have designated as korban or a gift to be used for the service of God doesn't have to be used for anything else. Now, what was happening in Jesus' time and place is people would have obligations to take care of their mother and father. And what people would do instead would be take their resources and declare those resources to be korban, dedicated for the use of God. However, they might not actually put them to the use of God, but they would use that cover, they would use that legal designation to ultimately not provide for their mother and father, to ultimately not follow through the instructions that God has for them, to ultimately not be the kind of people that God wanted them to be. And worse, they were using religious regulations and human religious teachings as their excuse and cover for not doing so. That's exactly what your huge frustration about ritual purity and impurity is leading to. It's nothing, right? It ultimately has nothing to do with what it really is to live a life that's pleasing to God. And that's what you should be focused on, not nitpicking into finer detail all of these human teachings. Make more sense? Okay, individually or as a group, I want us to have some fun. Where do we see that at work today? Does that still happen in the world in which you live? Do people find ways to have external markers of piety and playing by the rules and checking the boxes and doing this, that, or the other, but ultimately using those marks of piety to not be the kind of people that God would really have them be? Where do we see that happen? And if you're ready, where do you face that temptation in your own life? Because that is not an issue that's located in the time and place of Jesus' preaching and teaching. It's something that's true in all human hearts. So, where do we see that at work, even in our lives today? Picking back up in verse 14 through verse 23. Then Jesus called the crowd again and said, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. Nothing outside of a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, the things that come out of a person contaminate the person." After leaving the crowd, he entered a house where his disciples asked him about that riddle. He said to them, "Don't you understand either? Don't you know that nothing from the outside that enters a person has the power to contaminate? That's because it doesn't enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and it goes out into the sewer." By saying this, Jesus declared that no food could contaminate a person in God's sight. It's what comes out of a person that contaminates someone in God's sight, he says. It's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, and foolishness. All these evil things come from the inside and contaminate a person in God's sight. What Jesus is doing here is absolutely blowing up the worldview that is so common in the community around him that says, if I observe all of these external markers and make sure I don't touch anything or anyone that could be considered contaminating or dirty, then I am deeply pleasing to God. And what Jesus points out is what is deeply pleasing to God and what ultimately contaminates, quote unquote, someone in the eyes of God is not from all of those external markers. It's not from anything outside. It's what comes from the heart. It's the inside that really matters. So, the summary of that is easy. It's the inside, it's what's in the heart, and it's how what's in the heart manifests itself in your actions toward yourself and towards others in the world that really matters. The summary is easy, but the implication is tough. Because that means that pleasing God and living the God that life would have us live is ultimately about real life change, real heart change, not just checking a lot of boxes. And that's easier said than done. So I want to leave us with this in this studying today, is to make sure that you understand that your spiritual life is not a whole bunch of shoulds and should nots. It can seem like that, particularly when we get a list like this from Jesus. But your spiritual life is not just a collection of shoulds and should nots. What it is about is opening up yourself so that your heart would be as God would have it be. And the good news of Christian life and faith is that's not something that's up to your own hard work or your own discipline or your own energy. The way that your heart becomes like the heart that Jesus is describing is by letting him into it. And I don't mean just one time praying and asking him to do so. That is an excellent place to start, but that's not where it ends. What a life of transformation looks like is daily and regularly opening your heart and your entire life to the transforming power, which we call grace, of Christ. We do that through worshiping, playing, praying, serving, giving, and living a life of joy, understanding that the world that God has created is good. And the more we do that, the more the transforming grace of Christ turns our heart into exactly the kind of heart that God made us to have. And that ultimately, more than any of these external markers of piety or purity, is what is deeply pleasing to God. That's the question that the people should have asked Jesus, and that's the answer that he gave. So, in our final discussion, I just want to ask, what's the easiest way for you to open your heart and your life up to the transforming grace of Christ right now? Is it worshiping? Is it playing? Is it praying? Is it giving? Is it serving? Is it learning? What's the easiest way for you? The most transformative way? And what are the ways in which you still have room to grow? Because that's the place, more so than trying harder or taking shoulds or should nots more seriously, that real life change is going to happen. Friends, God bless you. I'm glad you were part of this study today, and I can't wait to continue our study with you soon.